On a brittle Tuesday morning in November, the kind that smelled of dead leaves and impending snow, Captain Margaret Ellen Holt walked into the Allegheny County Courthouse wearing a gray wool coat, 2 sizes too large, in shoes that had seen better days on better roads. She was 51 years old, slight-boned, with close-cropped silver hair, and the kind of pale blue eyes that had watched men die with their mothers' names on their lips. Nobody in that marble lobby would have guessed. She had once been the most decorated combat nurse in her unit. Not the woman clutching a manila envelope with white-knuckled hands. Not the woman who kept her gaze on the floor as though she were reading something written there just for her. Margaret had not asked to be, or she had not asked for any of this. The legal notice had arrived 6 weeks earlier in a plain white envelope, wedged between a water bill and a coupon circular for a grocery store she no longer had the energy to drive to. Her landlord, a thick-necked man named Gerald Pruitt, who smelled perpetually of cigar smoke and grievance, had filed for eviction. The claim was straightforward in the way that cronies often present themselves as simple arithmetic. 3 months of partial rent, an accumulation she had been chipping at since her disability checks began arriving late, and then not at all, following a clerical error at the Veterans Benefits Administration that had taken the better part of 4 months to resolve. The error had been theirs. The consequences were hers. She took a seat on a wooden bench in the hallway, outside courtroom 7B, and opened her envelope for the 4th time that morning, though she had memorized every page. Bank statements, a letter from the VA acknowledging the payment error and confirming restoration of benefits, receipts for every partial payment she had made, and a formal apology from the Regional Benefits Office. All of it organized in chronological order with the precision of a woman who had once coordinated triage under mortar fire in Kandahar province. Margaret had served 3 combat deployments with the United States Army Nurse Corps, 1 to Iraq, 2 to Afghanistan. She had held pressure on wounds with her bare hands. She had made impossible decisions in 30-second windows. Paperwork, she had always believed, was something she could handle. She had not brought an attorney. She could not afford one, and the legal aid office had a 3-week wait. A volunteer from a veterans assistance nonprofit had offered to accompany her, but his car had broken down that morning, a phone call that reached her as she was already on the bus. Watching Pittsburgh's gray November slide past the window, she had thanked him, told him it would be fine, and then sat very still for the remaining 11 stops, willing herself to believe that. She had held pressure on wounds with her bare hands. She had made impossible decisions in 30-second windows. Paperwork, she had always believed, was something she could handle. Margaret had grown up in Meadville, Pennsylvania, the second of 4 children born to a Methodist minister and a school librarian. She had been a serious child, not unhappy, but serious, the kind who read the encyclopedia for pleasure and kept her journal with a lock whose key she never lost. She had enlisted at 22, the year after nursing school, because a recruiter had spoken at her college career fair and said something about service that lodged itself in her chest like a splinter she had no interest in removing. Her parents had worried. Her mother had cried. Margaret had shipped out 8 months later and discovered, to no one's greater surprise than her own, that she was extraordinarily good at exactly this: keeping people alive in conditions specifically designed to kill them. She thought about none of that as she waited. She thought instead about the hearing, about the judge, about the 3-inch stack of documents that she hoped, prayed. Even though her relationship with prayer had become complicated over the years, would be sufficient to explain what had happened and why, despite everything. She was not a woman who simply did not pay her rent. She thought about her apartment, small and spare and exactly to her liking, with a window that overlooked a maple tree that turned to color in October. She had never been able to name precisely. Not orange, not red, something richer than either. She thought about the silence of it, the particular quality of quiet she had spent years learning to inhabit after years of noise that rattled the bones. She was not going to lose that apartment. She had decided this on the bus. She repeated it now, twice, under her breath. Like a field dressing pressed firm against a wound. At 9:47, a bailiff appeared in the hallway doorway and called her name. Margaret Ellen Holt rose from the bench, straightened her coat, tucked the envelope firmly under her arm, and walked through the door into courtroom 7B, where Judge Randall F. Beaumont was already seated behind the bench, his expression suggesting he had somewhere better to be. Judge Beaumont was 63, thick, with a reputation in the courthouse for brisk efficiency that courthouse regulars interpreted charitably as competence and others, but experienced as impatience dressed in a robe. He had served on the bench for 19 years. He handled, by his own estimate, upward of 40 cases on a given morning. Eviction hearings, in his taxonomy, were near the bottom of the complexity scale. Open and shut affairs. Generally speaking, documents exchanged. Judgment entered. Next case. He did not look up when Margaret approached the plaintiff's table. He was already reading something on his desk. Gerald Pruitt sat at the opposite table with his attorney, a young man in a sharp suit who wore his confidence the way new officers wore their rank slightly too forward. Pruitt himself did not look at Margaret either. He examined his nails. Margaret set her envelope on the table, folded her hands on top of it, and waited, outside the high windows. The November sky had gone, the color of old pewter, when the gavel falls on the wrong side of justice. Judge Beaumont called the case at 9:52 and got things moving at a pace that suggested he had already decided the outcome before the first document was entered into the record. The landlord's attorney, whose name Margaret would later learn was Bradford Sims, a fact that seemed to suit him perfectly, rose with practiced fluency and walked through the filing in under 4 minutes. 3 months of incomplete payment, notice properly served. Repeated attempts at resolution, unmet. The mathematics were, he suggested with a small gesture of open palms, undeniable. He sat down with the satisfied air of a man who has done the easy part of an easy job. Judge Beaumont turned to Margaret. Ms. Holt, you're representing yourself? Yes, Your Honor. All right. Response. Margaret stood. She had prepared remarks. She had, in fact, prepared 3 versions of remarks, concise, detailed, and a middle version she had settled on at midnight the night before. She began with the VA payment error, explained it plainly, referenced the letter she had brought. As Exhibit A, she spoke clearly and without apology, the way she had been taught to deliver field reports: facts first, context second, conclusion supported. She was 2 minutes into her explanation when Judge Beaumont raised a hand. Ms. Holt, I'm going to stop you there. Do you have proof of the full outstanding balance being The payments have been restored, Your Honor. But the back balance? Do you have proof of remittance? Yes or no? Not yet. The restoration only. Then you are in arrears. He made a note. Mr. Sims, is your client prepared to accept a payment schedule, or my client prefers judgment in vacancy? Your Honor, she had not come to beg. She had come with evidence. There was a difference, and she intended it to matter, even if no one in this room yet understood that. Margaret's jaw tightened. Your Honor, if I may, she reached for her envelope, extracting the VAS formal letter of acknowledgement. This document, signed by the Regional Director of Veterans Benefits, confirms that the payment lapse was the result of a federal administrative error. I've been paying what I could throughout. I have receipts for every partial payment. I have correspondence showing I've reported the issue within the first month. Judge Beaumont took the letter, read it for approximately 15 seconds, and handed it back. This acknowledges an error. It does not clear the outstanding balance. I understand that, Your Honor. I'm asking for time. The benefits have been restored. I can bring the balance current within Ms. Holt. This court is not a payment plan negotiation service. He was already reaching for his gavel. Judgment for the Your Honor. Her voice was steady, not loud. Steady. I am a United States Army veteran. I served 3 combat deployments. The reason I am in this situation is because the federal government made an error processing benefits I earned. I am asking this court to consider that context before your military service is noted and appreciated. The tone in which he said it suggested it was neither. It does not, however, relieve you of your financial obligations to your landlord. Judgment for what happened next took less than 10 seconds and changed everything in the room. As Margaret reached back into her envelope for a final document, her discharge papers, which she had included on the advice of the veteran's advocate, the envelope caught on the edge of the table. It tilted, the papers inside shifted, and from somewhere in the fold of documents, from wherever it had nestled unseen among the pages, a small object slid free, caught a fraction of the fluorescent courtroom light, and struck the tile floor. With a sound that was, in that silent room, enormous. A metal, bronze and ribbon, spinning once on the cold tile before settling flat. Everyone looked at it. Even Bradford Sims looked at it. Even Gerald Prude, who had been examining his phone, looked at it. The bailiff near the door took a single step forward. Judge Beaumont's gavel hand froze mid-dark. Margaret looked down at the floor. She had forgotten it was in there. She had slipped it into the envelope weeks ago when she was gathering documents, meaning to put it back in the small cedar box on her bedroom shelf where she kept such things, and had simply forgotten. It was the bronze star, the one with the V device for valor. She stared at it for a moment. Then she bent and picked it up. The courtroom was completely silent. Judge Beaumont said, very quietly, "What is that?" Margaret held it in her palm. She had not planned this. She had not planned any of this part. It's a bronze star, Your Honor, with valor device. She paused. I received it for actions in Kunar Province, 2011. Something moved across Randall Beaumont's face. It was not as Oli named. He had been on the bench for 19 years. He had seen a great many things. He had not, in those 19 years, seen a woman in an oversized coat produce a combat valor medal from an eviction case file. Sit down, Ms. Holt, he said. His voice had changed. Everyone, sit down. We're going to start this over. Section 3. What the record did not show the weight of a war. No one in the room had fought. There is a particular quality to silence that follows a revelation, not the silence of emptiness, but the silence of recalibration. The sound, a room, makes when the people inside it are quietly revising what they thought they understood. Courtroom 7B had gone exactly that quiet. Bradford Sims had set down his pen. Gerald Pruitt had put his phone in his pocket. The bailiff near the door stood with his arms loose at his sides. Even the heating system, which had been cycling with a low mechanical groan all morning, seemed to pause. Judge Beaumont had removed his reading glasses and was looking at Margaret Holt with the specific attention of a man who is reconsidering his assumptions one by one, like a man walking back across ice, testing each step. "Ms. Holt," he said, "I'd like you to tell me in your own words, in whatever time you need the full context of your situation." Margaret set the medal on the table in front of her. She did not make a display of it. She did not use it as a prop. "She'll set it down the way you set down something you have been carrying a long time, carefully, with both hands." Then she folded those hands and looked at the judge and told him the truth. She had served from 2001 to 2019. She said, 18 years, 3 combat deployments, Mosul in 2004, Helmand in 2009, Kunar in 2011. After that last deployment, she had returned home to a body that worked differently than it had before. Chronic pain from a spinal compression injury, sustained when a vehicle she was riding in struck an IED outside a forward operating base. 2 of the 4 people in that vehicle had not come home. She considered that every day, both the gift and the weight of it. She had left the army on a medical discharge in 2019. She had relocated to Pittsburgh to be near her younger sister, the last of her immediate family still living. She had tried to work first at a hospital, then at a clinic, but the standing hours were incompatible with her injury on the days it was at its worst. And those days came without schedule or announcement. She had applied for and received VA disability benefits. They were not generous, but they were sufficient, provided they arrived when expected. When the payment error occurred in late spring, a data migration issue in the VAS benefit system, she had been told, affecting an indeterminate number of veterans, they did not arrive when expected. And then they did not arrive at all. She had tried to work, but the standing hours were incompatible with her injury on the days it was at its worst, and those days came without schedule or announcement. She had contacted the VA immediately. She had documentation of this. She produced it now. A timeline of calls and correspondence that she had organized with the same methodical precision she had once applied to patient intake under combat conditions. She had contacted her landlord and explained the situation. She had paid what she could each month from savings and from small amounts her sister had lent her, which she had recorded carefully and intended to repay. She had not been hiding. She had not been negligent. She had been caught in the gap between a system that owed her something and a system that was slow to understand that. Judge Beaumont listened to all of this without interrupting. This alone was unusual enough that Bradford Sims shifted in his chair twice and Gerald Pruitt began examining his hands with less certainty than before. When Margaret finished, the judge asked her one question, the Bronze Star with valor. What was it for? She was quiet for a moment. Outside the high windows, the pewter sky had deepened toward the color of a bruise. When she spoke, her voice remained even, but it had taken on a quality that was not quite distance and not quite grief. Something more deliberate than either. There was a mass casualty event, she said. A vehicle-borne IED outside a village in Kunar. We received 12 casualties in under 20 minutes. One of my medics was badly wounded in the initial blast. I took over his position and managed triage while maintaining care for the existing patients. We lost 2. We saved 9. She paused. The citation says I performed actions above and beyond. I've always thought that was the wrong way to say it. I just did what needed to be done because the people in front of me needed it done. The room said nothing. There was nothing adequate to say to that in a room where the largest conflict of the morning had, until 11 minutes ago, been a lease dispute. Bradford Sims was looking at his legal pad with the expression of a man who has arrived at an argument and found, to his quiet discomfort, that it no longer fits. Gerald Pruitt was staring at the middle distance with the look of someone who had prepared for a particular version of a story and discovered he had the wrong one. He was not, Margaret would note later, a cruel man, not in the way she had encountered cruelty in places where it announced itself without apology. He was an ordinary man who had stopped, at some point, imagining lives other than his own, and was now being required to begin again. Judge Beaumont picked up his pen, set it down, picked it up again. He had a son, Margaret did not know this, who had served 2 tours in Iraq with the Marine Corps and come home changed in ways that his father still, after years, did not fully know how to reach. The judge had never spoken of this in court. It was not relevant to any case he had ever presided over. It was relevant, suddenly, to everything. "Mr. Sims," he said, "I'd like a word with your client." The verdict the law allowed, and the one that mattered. The recess lasted 14 minutes. Margaret sat in the hallway on the same wooden bench where she had waited earlier. The manila envelope in her lap and the Bronze Star returned to its place inside, resting against the VA letter, like 2 documents making the same argument in different languages. She had not cried in the courtroom. She had not cried in the hallway. She sat in the way she had learned to sit in field hospitals between emergencies, fully still on the outside. Everything moving on the inside, conserving what was needed for whatever came next. A janitor pushed a cart past the end of the hallway and did not look at her. A young woman in a business suit hurried by, heels sharp on the tile. Somewhere on another floor, a child's voice echoed briefly and was gone. She thought about her apartment, the maple tree, the particular silence of 4 in the morning when her pain was bad and she sat by the window with a cup of tea and watched the street below, empty and amberlit, and understood in those hours better than any other that she was alive and that it meant something, even when the meaning was hard to hold. The door to courtroom 7B opened. Bradford Sims leaned out and asked her to come back in. Gerald Pruitt was standing when she entered, which was not a thing she had expected. He was a large man, and the standing seemed to cost him something. Not physically, but in the way that certain small gestures cost people who have not made them in a long time. He looked at her with the direct attention of someone who has been spoken to by a lawyer and has subsequently done some looking inward that the lawyer did not specifically instruct. "Miss Holt," he said. I didn't know what you were dealing with." He stopped. Tried again. "I mean, I knew the payments were short. I didn't know why." My attorney said. He glanced at Bradford Sims, who offered no assistance. "I want to withdraw the filing." Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "Mr. Pruitt, I want to be clear that I intend to bring the balance current. I have the funds now. I can pay you today, not everything, but a significant portion, and the remainder within 30 days. I have that in writing from my bank." "No," he said. "Sims told me." He paused. "I'm withdrawing the filing." She was thinking about the men and women who had no medal to drop, whose sacrifices had no bronze face and no ribbon, the ones who had come home to eviction notices and waited on benches alone. Judge Beaumont, when they returned to formal proceedings, did several things that were within his authority but were not, by any means, required. He formally acknowledged the VA documentation on the record, noting that the payment lapse had been the result of a federal administrative failure and not tenant negligence, language that Margaret's veterans advocate would later tell her could be useful if any secondary reporting affected her rental history. He asked the clerk to flag the case file with a notation directing any future related matters to a specialist docket that handled veterans' housing issues. He also, in the pause before calling the next case, removed his glasses and spoke to her directly, not as a judge to a party but in the plainly human register of one person to another. "Captain Holt," he said. He had reviewed her discharge papers during the recess. "This court owes you an apology for the pace at which this morning began. I moved too fast. That was a failure of this proceeding." Margaret nodded once. "Thank you, Your Honor." She was out of the building by 11:15. The November air hit her face with the cold clarity of something earned. She stood on the courthouse steps for a moment, envelope under her arm, and looked at the street, the traffic, the people, the ordinary Tuesday machinery of a city that had no idea what had just happened inside one of its rooms. She breathed. She had not cried in the courtroom, in the hallway, in the recess, or during the judge's remarks. She cried now, briefly and without embarrassment, standing on the courthouse steps in a coat 2 sizes too large. Because she was a woman who had learned long ago that feeling things fully was not weakness. It was what you did when you were safe enough to do it. And this, at last, was one of those moments. Her phone buzzed. Her sister, calling to ask how it had gone. Margaret almost answered, then looked at the phone for a moment. She was thinking not about herself. She was thinking about the men and women who had no medal to drop, the ones whose paperwork was in order, but who had no bronze star to pivot, a proceeding, no valor device to make a stranger reckon with the weight of what they carried, the ones who had come home to eviction notices and medical bills and a bureaucracy that processed their sacrifices at the same indifferent pace it processed everything else, and who had waited on benches outside courtrooms alone, without advocates, or documentation, or the particular leverage of a small bronze decoration that happened to fall from a file at the right moment. Now she thought about them, all the way home on the bus. The maple tree outside her window was bare now. November had taken the last of its leaves, but she knew the shape of it well enough to imagine what it held inside. Patient and depruded, waiting for another season to show itself. She put her key in the lock of her apartment door. The tumblers turned. The door swung inward into quiet and warmth and the life she had fought, in ways visible and invisible, to keep. Margaret Ellen Holt set the envelope on the kitchen table, took off her coat, and put on the kettle for tea. The metal went back to its cedar box on the bedroom shelf. She closed the box gently, ran her thumb once across the lid, and went to stand by the window, watching the bare maple against the gray November sky, thinking about justice and luck, in all the ways they are not the same thing, and all the reasons they should be.